Took a bit. Okay, we are live. Hello and welcome to another episode of Conscious Living, where we air every week in Vancouver on CFRO 100.5 FM in Vancouver. My name is Marc Caron, and again, today we're, like we do every year at about this time, it's quite often our spirit plant medicine episodes where we talk to our upcoming speakers who are going to be presenting at the conference. And today we're going to do just that. But before we get started, I want to introduce my co-host and great friend in producing the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, Mr. Stephen Gray. Stephen, a pleasure to see you again.
Oh, yes. Always lovely, Mark.
It's that time of year where we have a fortunate opportunity to speak to some brilliant minds in the world of this psychedelic renaissance that's joining us. And before we get any further, I just want to thank everybody for joining us here in our live Zoom studio audience, where we're going to have a Q&A after the fact. And if you're actually watching this live now on any of the social media platforms and where we're streaming out, there's links down below. You can actually join us here in Zoom if you want to be part of the studio audience. So, Stephen, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our guest today.
Oh, thanks a lot, Mark. Yes, and I'm delighted actually to be doing this, and I don't mean that as a platitude, because it's Rick Doblin, and many people know who Rick is. Excuse me, but we're very grateful that he's been able to join us today and come and speak at the conference, because he's a very in-demand and very busy person with a lot of great projects in mind. Now, Mark was hoping that we would hear a little bit about Rick's, what inspired him to get into this and where it went from there. And Rick, I will invite you to add to or correct anything I say, but I was hoping that we could get into the meat of the matter by me giving a really short synopsis of that, because it's fresh on my mind. In fact, I just read a Washington Post, as the Yankees say, WAPO article this morning about you. And so as I say, feel free to add or correct anything I say, Rick, but I'll just say that Rick has been working on the things that he's working on now for decades, 40 years or more. Again, according to this article this morning, and I knew this anyway, one or more very powerful visionary experiences with psychedelics prompted Rick to feel that he wanted to help more people understand and make use of these. And one thing I did not know about Rick is that he was involved in trying to prevent the DEA and whomever from making MDMA illegal way back in the mid-'80s. That was very interesting. And then apparently he decided that the way forward was going to be to get legal FDA recognition for these substances. So it's been a very powerful vision that Rick has been working on all these years, and excuse me, and still at it with great power, great commitment. However, and this is I'm going to use as a segue into a question, Rick. And again, you can lead it in other directions, and as I say, add to or correct anything I did say about that extremely brief bio. But there have been problems lately, as some know and some don't. The big problem, as far as I know, is that MAPS, the organization that Rick founded and is president of, created an organization called Lycos Therapeutics to do the actual work of presenting proposals to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, in the hopes of gaining approval for MDMA as a therapeutic tool in several different kinds of contexts. Oh, and I left out a really important thing. Along the way, maps, well, again, I don't want to talk too long about it, but as I understand it, Rick chose MDMA as the kind of the leading edge of the wedge because it was understandable to authorities. It affected people that they could relate to, soldiers, etc., and things like that. But I also know that Rick is a great proponent that all psychedelics should be granted legal sanction. Nonetheless, Lycos,
but all things. I think that it's kind of a controversial thing to say, but I think the more dangerous the drug, the more important it is that it be legal.
Absolutely, a good one. Yeah. So I'll just quickly finish up and you can take it from there. That Lycos applied for this approval and was rejected, and the FDA apparently had some problems with the studies themselves. So I guess the question I'd like to lead in with, if you're okay with talking about it, is for you to tell us the story of what happened with the Lycos situation and the application.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I'll just add before that, just for those people that may not know, that I've had sort of two parallel tracks. It was basically 52 years ago, when I was 18 years old, that I decided to focus my life's work on psychedelics. And the two parallel tracks have been, on the one hand, psychotherapy, scientific research, psychotherapy, drug development, and on the other hand has been drug policy reform and trying to move to a post-prohibition world. And in the process of that, so I've trained with Stan Groff, and I'm certified holotropic breathwork practitioner, Stan being the premier LSD researcher. And I also have undergraduate degree in psychotherapy, transpersonal psychology, and psychedelic therapy and research, and then a master's and PhD in public policy from Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So I basically went from trying to be a therapist for individuals, and then when the politics was blocking the research, I wanted to try to get a clinical psych PhD. I realized that it was impossible to get permission at the time. This was in the 80s, and so the politics was in the way of the science, so I decided I had to study the politics. And so that was more like therapy for culture. I went from therapy for individuals to therapy for culture. And I think what happened with Lycos is that this pharmaceutical company that MAPS created in 2014, MAPS I started in 1986, actually started a different nonprofit in 1984. I learned about MDMA in 1982. I learned about LSD and really appreciated it in 1972. And that's where I learned that I'd been the believer of a whole lot of propaganda about LSD. I thought, you take it 5 or 6 times, you're certifiably insane, it hurts your chromosomes, all these things that I was not sophisticated enough to realize were not true. But I learned about LSD and the value of LSD therapy after the backlash, and I learned about MDMA in '82 before the backlash. And that's where I realized that I could get politically involved. And so started this nonprofit, Earth Metabolic Design Lab. It was connected to Buckminster Fuller. And I created that, or basically took it over from a friend of mine who had run it but hadn't used it for a long time. And that was the organization that gathered together those people that were interested in psychedelics in the early to middle 80s. And we knew that MDMA was a therapy drug from the middle 70s, but it escaped in the late 70s, early 80s, and it became known as ecstasy in public settings. And so it was doomed. This was Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan time in the US and escalation of the drug war. So I realized that when I learned about it, that it was only temporarily going to be legal. And that's where I realized, since I've learned about LSD after the backlash, now I learned, after the backlash, now I learned about MDMA before the backlash. And that's where we had a legal defense. We knew that the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, would eventually try to criminalize MDMA. We were prepared and introduced MDMA to all sorts of people that were willing to do things that were legal, and then would be willing to stand up and testify. So it was clear that we were winning the case. We were winning in the court of public opinion, winning in the courts, and DEA kind of freaked out. And when the hearings were still going on in '85, emergency scheduled MDMA. We later won the hearing. The judge said MDMA should stay available as a medicine, and the DEA rejected that recommendation. And it was clear that no matter what happened in the legal process, that we would not be able to really keep MDMA as a legal option for people as a legal medicine to assist psychotherapy. And so once that was clear, I realized the only way going forward was going to be through the FDA, through science, through drug development, and to try to get new studies. One of the beautiful things in America and much of the world is that when you do science, there's such an interest in science that you get what's called earned media. So that when we do science, we can have lots of people hear about the science, and then that causes them to question some of the propaganda that they might have heard. And so when I started MAPS in '86, I knew that MDMA had been invented by Merck in 1912, and that it would be in the public domain, that there was no patents possible on MDMA. I also knew that MDMA had been used as a therapy drug before I even heard about it in 1982, so that it really wasn't possible to patent the uses of MDMA either, because they were already widely used in psychotherapy. About 500,000 doses had been used before it became criminalized, for all different reasons and purposes. And so I just assumed that MDMA would become a generic drug, and that the only way forward was philanthropy. And so from 1986 through 2014, I still believed that MDMA would become a generic drug, that there was no real way to use traditional pharma tricks to patent some different things. So I really didn't understand fully what was going on, but I did realize that once I couldn't get into a clinical psych PhD program because the politics was really anti doing research, psychotherapy outcome studies with MDMA, that's where I realized I needed to really learn more about policy. And so I started getting my master's in public policy. I took a class at Harvard Law School on food and drug regulation by the leading expert, Peter Barton Hutt. He wrote the textbook. He was an FDA lawyer before he was senior partner in a big DC law firm, and would come to Harvard Law School every January to do the interterm, where you do one thing at a time. So I took his class, did well in it. Peter later became on my dissertation committee, and in 2001, I completed my dissertation. I got my PhD, and my dissertation was on the medical use and the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. So I assumed that I basically knew all that I needed to do. I did a lot of work on how to do a double-blind study as a big part of my dissertation. But what happened in 2014, and this will, I think, lay the groundwork for understanding what started to go wrong and led to this FDA rejection, was that in the course of the history of MAPS, we've raised somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 million in donations. And this was because people were really compelled to and persuaded that this nonprofit drug development of MDMA was worth supporting, that the healing potentials were great, but also that could change people's attitudes about MDMA and other psychedelics. And what I didn't realize, and I discovered this in 2014, was that I went to an event that in where I live here in Belmont, which is right next to McLean Hospital, which is one of the world's leading psychiatric research centers, part of Harvard Medical School, sorry. And what I learned, I met a patent attorney there, and what he said was that there was something that actually had been in existence since 1984, 2 years before I started MAPS, that Ronald Reagan had signed into law a bill, the Hatch-Waxman Act, and that it had provided incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. And these incentives are called data exclusivity. And what that means is you don't have a patent, but you can have exclusive use of your data for, right now in the US, it's 5 years. And that's the basics. If you do pediatric studies, which FDA had said that they would require of Lykos if they got approval in adults, they'd have to do pediatric studies. You get an extra 6 months. So that's 5.5 years of data exclusivity, and it kind of blocks FDA from reviewing the package of a potential generic competitor till the 5.5 years is over, and takes them by 6 months to a year or so. And so there's 6.5 years or something like that of data exclusivity. And all of a sudden, once I realized that, I was just, first off, extremely humbled and astonished that there was something so fundamental to my understanding of what was going on that I had completely missed. And in a way, it's not that surprising, because pharmaceutical companies don't really use data exclusivity. They only go where there's patents, where they want longer periods of time in order to recoup their investments and make a whole bunch of profit. But once I learned that there was such a thing as data exclusivity, it really changed everything. And what I realized then is that if we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which is a for-profit company that is not like your traditional for-profit companies, in that in a traditional for-profit company, you have to maximize profits. That's the obligation of the management, and the shareholders can throw the management out if they think they're not maximizing profits. But you get a lot of externalities, a lot of problems where your sole focus is just how much money can I make? And so there's a modification of capitalism called the Public Benefit Corporation. And there's thousands of them now. And that's where you maximize public benefit. It's still a profit-making company, but profit is not your number one objective. Public benefit is, and how you articulate that is really important. Then what became clear to me was that I needed to tell a different story to the donors, that we're doing research with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and there's other uses of MDMA. And if I keep needing to go back to donors for each specific use, might end up exhausting the donors. And so by creating the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, we would be able to generate income, profits, that then would be used for further research. So as our need for capital was growing, now I could tell a different story, that we could develop this engine of a pharmaceutical company, but it wouldn't be a normal one. It would be based in public benefit, but it would be wholly owned by the nonprofit. So that was the vision, this wholly owned pharmaceutical company focused on public benefit, owned by a nonprofit. Now, what happened then is for the next couple of years, everything was fine. And in November 29th, 2016, we had what's called the end of phase 2 meeting that we negotiated with FDA. We got permission to go to phase 3, which is the final stage of research to try to prove safety and efficacy. And instead of doing that, going immediately to do that, I knew that there was a lot of issues about the double-blind study, about how you do double blinds with psychedelics, a lot of other issues. And that it was going to be necessary to really negotiate every aspect of the protocol design with the FDA. And so we spent another 8 months to do that, and we got what's called an agreement letter. FDA came to agreement with us on what we should be, how we should design this study. And then we started doing the research. But what that meant was that we had shown that it was now possible to work through the FDA system. And also there had been really important research with psilocybin in particular. And that the psilocybin research was promising, was moving forward really well. And there started to be a for-profit company, Compass Pathways, that grew out of Hefter Research, which was one of the nonprofits doing psychedelic research. And then more and more companies started developing for-profit companies to the point where now there's hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies doing all different things, new molecules, drug development, running clinics, working in the back office kind of things, all different ones. And so to give you a sense of what happened, MAPS, in combination with Hefter Research Institute, the Beckley Foundation, Council on Spiritual Practices, these were the main nonprofits. So I would say by this point, this point where we're at now, roughly $300 million has been raised in donations for psychedelic research. However, in the last 4 years, $4 billion has been put into for-profit psychedelic companies. So you can see the advantage of moving from nonprofit trying to get donations to for-profit trying to take in investors. But what that meant is that it was very difficult for us to continue to raise the money that we needed in donations. And so we felt that unfortunately, that was the case. And we felt that the biggest loss of public benefit was to run out of money and not develop MDMA into a medicine. So in order to do that, we needed to take in investors. And so we've now raised somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 million or so from investors. MAPS has only minority ownership of Lykos. We've sort of lost control to a group of, it's becoming ever more like a traditional pharmaceutical company. And so that's the background for people to understand. And so I would say that what went wrong with the FDA advisory committee meeting, the FDA decision, is that there was a fundamental mistake that was made by the pharmaceutical company, which was to think that we had made so much progress with the culture, that there was so many of these psychedelic for-profit companies, there was so much positive media about all the promise that a lot of the fears had been replaced by a hope for healings for all different ways, that the pharmaceutical company felt that we had reached a point where what really mattered, what only mattered, was the data, and that this was now a rational process of evaluating the data. And what they did is they took their eyes off of the culture, and they tried to institute what they called a quiet period. And so for years, several years, as this pharmaceutical company was developing more and more and more, it would just try to focus on negotiations with FDA or sharing that. But it would, in this quiet period, which maybe makes sense when you've got a drug that nobody's ever heard of, that's not a recreational drug, that hasn't been around for 40 years, that, in America, roughly 22 million people have tried MDMA, and way, way more around the world. And so culture is really what governs what kind of science can be done. It's not the other way around. So culture, with Nixon declaring Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America, and the FDA creating the, Nixon, the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and then FDA shut down psychedelic research for decades. So that was culture. That was not science. There was no real scientific justification for not having psychedelic research going on. And so it's really clear that the culture is what permits science to take place. I mean, we know, for example, this is just a long time ago example, but Galileo, who was involved in trying to figure out that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, the church arrested him. He died under house arrest. So we think of Galileo as such a hero, and he was persecuted by the church. So this sort of tension between culture and science, I think what happened was that this pharmaceutical company that we had created got filled by more and more traditional people from pharma. really didn't understand how delicate the context was within which we were doing this work. And then there was a series of decisions that was made and various criticisms in media and other places that the pharmaceutical company decided not to respond to. And what that meant was it created a big vacuum. And in that vacuum, there was criticisms and negativity, and it wasn't responded to. So basically, Lycos lost control of the narrative. And that now, what part of the narrative was the most complicated? And I'll talk now about functional unblinding.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because the WAPO article mentioned blinding problems, and also they had doubts about the fact that some participants had used MDMA before and therefore would be predisposed to expect a benefit.
Yeah, so let me start with that, which is easier. So, in this 8-month special protocol assessment, we negotiated everything with the FDA about how to do the studies. And the FDA never said, don't enroll people that have done MDMA before. We did have it where we didn't want people that have done MDMA more than a certain number of times. But I think it's totally appropriate for critics to raise criticisms. The whole point of science is you try to invalidate results, and that's where replication comes in. But the concern was, okay, you've got 40% of the people that have done ecstasy at least once in their life, and 60% had not. Now, first thing to say is these 40% that have done ecstasy before, they still had PTSD. So clearly, it's not just you take the drug and you're better. It's really, in our view, it's about the therapy. It's about the context that you take the drug. But if you look at the data, the 60% of the people that did not have prior experience with MDMA did not have fewer or did not have lower responses in terms of a reduction of PTSD symptoms than the 40% who had done MDMA before. And then furthermore, this idea was, oh, these 40% have done MDMA, they really like MDMA, they're going to have fewer side effects. Well, that was not the case either. So there was no fundamental difference between the group that got the 60% that had never done MDMA before and the 40% that had done MDMA before. So it's okay to raise this kind of question. First off, as I said, the FDA never said, don't enroll people who've done MDMA before. And then it's appropriate to ask that question, might there be a difference between those people that had done MDMA before or not? But there wasn't. So that's what I think happened a lot was at this advisory committee and others, there was all sorts of accusations and claims that were made, but there was not really a significant opportunity for the pharmaceutical company and others in that forum to respond, but they'd also been withdrawing from the public communications for quite a long time before that. So I think that particular criticism was wrong. There was other criticisms, oh, the studies weren't diverse, and therefore you couldn't generalize the results. Well, that was wrong as well. The second phase 3 study had over 50% were non-white. But I think the main issue was this concern about unblinding. And so I knew that that was going to be a big issue. That's why a big part of my dissertation was about this whole question of how do you do a double-blind study with psychedelics. And so what I had studied and what I had come up with, and I think this was right, was that the best way to do a double-blind study with psychedelics or any drug that you really know if you've taken it is to do, in our case, was to do therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. So that everybody knows they're getting MDMA, they're all expectancy is all the same, and then the challenge is to try to find out what's the dose that is high enough to start causing some confusion between that and the full dose, but not so high that you have so much therapeutic potential that you can never tell a difference between the two groups. So in our 16 years of phase 2 studies that we started in 2000 and had the end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA at the end of 2016, we studied therapy with inactive placebo, therapy with 25 milligrams of MDMA, therapy with 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100, 125, and 150 milligrams. So we basically did a pretty comprehensive dose response studies. And just to further clarify is that the approach that we had was that the longer you're in this therapeutic setting, the better. So 2 hours after the initial dose, we would give half the initial dose as a supplemental dose. And that would not make it stronger, but that would extend the plateau. And so what we discovered then from all these different studies was that it was possible to get a bit more blinding when you use these lower doses. But what we did not expect was that these lower doses, 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, that they tended to make people, now these are not just normal people, these are people with severe PTSD, they made them uncomfortable because ended up getting activation, but there wasn't sufficient fear reduction so that people didn't feel that they were really ready, able to do deep work on their traumas. And the metaphor that I often use is it's like an airplane, and there's turbulence at the beginning when you're taking off, but then you get high enough, and then it's sort of you're over the clouds and it's smooth sailing. So what we found is with these lower doses that the people still got better, but that it did make them uncomfortable. And so the people that got therapy with no MDMA at all, with inactive placebo, did better than the people that got therapy with low doses. And then what we discovered, we did one study that was with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. We had 3 different groups. One was 30 milligrams, one was 75 milligrams, and one was 125 milligrams. And in that study, we were really shocked to learn that the 75 milligram dose group did better than the 125. That's what we thought was the full therapeutic dose. So what it meant was it was lower, the dose was lower than we anticipated, where it started being really effective in a therapeutic context. So we were not able to find this sweet spot to where the dose either didn't compromise the therapy or accelerate the therapy as compared to therapy with inactive placebo. So, and this I think then is the most important point, is that we went to the FDA during this 8 month of discussions, and what we said was that this is what we've learned. If you would like blinding, we will be glad to use low dose MDMA, and it can really produce a bit more blinding than using inactive placebo, but you're going to make our job easier to find a difference between the 2 groups. Because if therapy with inactive placebo, resulted in better reductions in PTSD symptoms than therapy with low-dose MDMA, then using low-dose MDMA for blinding is going to make it easier to find a difference between the 2 groups. So we presented that to the FDA. We also said that there's another issue, which is that when you want to understand the safety profile, when you use therapy with inactive placebo, you're going to get a better view of the safety of working with severe or moderate severe PTSD patients with this kind of therapy. Because if there was 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 milligrams of MDMA, then you're not sure. Is this side effect that you might see from the MDMA? Is it from the therapy? Is it from the baseline? So we had people that over 90% of them in our studies had suicidal ideation. 40% of them had serious suicidal ideation. About a third of them had what's called positive behavior, which means that you actually either tried to kill yourself or you did something like you went to a bridge and thought about jumping off, but you didn't do it. So we did have one woman try to kill herself twice, and we had another woman had such severe suicidal ideation that she checked herself into a hospital not to kill herself. Both of these were in the placebo group, meaning therapy with inactive placebo. So we could say that this was from the condition that they have being in therapy. Now, to give you another example, the VA spent around 6 years comparing the two main psychotherapies for PTSD, prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, in around 916 veterans. And what they showed is that prolonged exposure was slightly better than cognitive processing therapy, but roughly half the people in either group dropped out of the study. The therapy itself was so re-traumatizing, not helpful, that people couldn't stay in the therapy. And so they dropped out. So this is again showing that it's difficult to do therapy with people that have such, powerful, painful traumas. So we said to the FDA, you tell us what you want to do. And so in this special protocol assessment process, the FDA chose that and told us to study therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA. And we made these agreements with the FDA. Now, the people that were in charge of the Division of Psychiatry with whom we made these agreements in 2017 changed. The director of Division of Psychiatry left, a new person came on, and the division became much more conservative. And so when it came time to review the data, the people that we had made this agreement with, and you're supposed to be agreeing with the agency, not with the people, you're making an agreement with the FDA, but the people that interpreted the data then, once we've completed most of our phase 3 studies, we're now much more conservative. And to give you an example of just that point, in the early part of our phase 2 progress, we went to the FDA and said, we would like a protocol, some way where legally we can give MDMA to therapists as part of their training so that they could understand what their patients are going through. The FDA understood that, and we worked it out, and we had a protocol. 125 people went through that protocol. Most of the people that worked on our phase 2 and phase 3 had this opportunity to experience MDMA themselves, and that gave them a better empathy and understanding. And we did a survey of 79 of them, and they were all, the average about how important was this to them professionally was substantial, was really, really high. Now, we went to another protocol to continue to do this after the management had shifted, and the Division of Psychiatry said, no way, we're never going to give you permission for a study to work with, to give therapists MDMA. And not only that, but your people are unqualified, that the lead person doesn't need to be just a master's level therapist. It needs to be an MD or a PhD. And on top of that, it's unsafe what you're doing. There needs to be a doctor on site, not on call. So for the negotiations that we had with FDA, we had a doctor on call. FDA agreed with that. We had licensed therapists as the lead person and not MD PhDs. So when the FDA then said, no, we're not going to let you do this study anymore to give therapists an MDMA experience, we submitted all this information and we said, look, here's the sites that had doctor on site, and here's the sites that had doctor on call, and there's no difference in safety. Here's the teams that had an MD PhD part of it. Here's the teams that didn't, no different in efficacy. And we kept being ignored, basically. And so we filed what's called a formal dispute resolution request, which is with lawyers that specialize in disputes with the FDA. Cost us over $250,000 on legal fees. And we won. The senior management of FDA reversed the FDA Division of Psychiatry. Now, we're in another situation where we've had a protocol for cannabis for PTSD, and similarly, the FDA has, I think, been unreasonable, and we're in this process of trying to change that. So FDA wasn't going to let us study smoked marijuana, wasn't going to let us study vaporized marijuana. We're importing higher potency marijuana from you guys in Canada. We're not going to use the low potency stuff get from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So I think all of this means to me that this issue of functional unblinding, we did our very best to address it. Now, Lykos has hired a fellow, David Huff, who worked on Spravato to make, this is ketamine esketamine to make it into a medicine for depression, which they did without therapy. But in an interview with Psychedelic Alpha, a newsletter for investors in psychedelics, what David Huff said is that this idea of a double-blind study is theoretically logical, but in practice, it rarely works.
Impossible, yeah.
Even for things that are not psychedelics. And so he talked about research with schizophrenia, and the antipsychotic drugs have such a strong side effect profile that many people are able to tell the difference. And Tom Lawford was the former head of psychiatry products. And he said that even SSRIs that you think, you take them, it takes a couple weeks sometimes for them to have an effect. I think that in that case, even then, the side effect profile is breaks the blind a lot of times.
Right.
So,
Hey, Rick,
sorry.
Excuse the interruption. We're starting to get up against the clock here. I know you have to go at the top of the hour. I also have to go at the top of the hour, and we do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. I know this has been an incredible story, and by the way, I'm not saying this to flatter you, but you're a great storyteller. So the rejection happened, and the WAPO article said that Mr. Doblin was unfazed. So that leads to the question of what are you prioritizing now, moving on? And I know you've talked about globalizing these substances. Could you talk about that a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions?
Yes. Okay. So I believe that in the current negotiations that are going to be going on between Lykos and the FDA, they will arrive at something. And Lykos will then raise the money to do it. And I think in 3 years or so, something like that, MDMA-assisted therapy should be approved for PTSD by the FDA. That's my current assumption. So what MAPS is doing as the nonprofit is to recognize that the for-profit is basically going to go to where the suffering is, but where there is money to be made. And the nonprofit wants to go where the suffering is, but where there's not that much money or no money to be made, where it's, high trauma, low resource countries. So what MAPS is trying to do is to globalize access. And the sort of vision has been, and the original vision that got me into MAPS and got me into psychedelics 52 years ago was this idea of consciousness change, that humanity as a whole is in danger.
No kidding.
In real danger. And so E.O. Wilson has said something that I thought was really profound. He said that the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies.
Wow.
And so what that means is that we have advanced in our brains so incredible that we can have this discussion in real time that people can see from all over the world on this internet. It's a miracle what we're doing, basically. I mean, but it's science. It's not real miracle, but it's a science. But it's miraculous. It's godlike technologies. And we have incredible weaponry. We have incredible abilities to produce energy, but we're destabilizing the planet, destabilizing the climate. So we don't have the emotional and spiritual maturity to handle the technologies that we have.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think that for MAPS, it's been about mass mental health and a spiritualized humanity. And what I mean by that simply is that when Galileo and Copernicus started saying that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that kind of displaced, it challenged some of the religious traditions. So for me, what a spiritualized humanity means is more metaphorical than literal. It's more about what a lot of the astronauts say when they look back at the Earth from space. We're all in this together. It's one thing. It's this planet, it's this life. And so if you have that primary identification, the sort of spiritual identification as being part of life on Earth, connected with the nature, connected with animals, connected with other people, that kind of experience can be the ground for appreciation of differences rather than fear of differences. And so that's the goal, has been this mass mental health, spiritualized humanity, helping people see through their traumas, but also drug policy reform, helping people have personal growth experience. So the global consciousness has always been a key part of what MAPS has. So the globalization is to now go to places where there are large amounts of trauma, but where we can train people with MDMA. So we're, for example, one of the projects that we're working on is in Bosnia, and it's with survivors of the roughly 30 years ago, the civil rights, the Srebrenica massacre. We're trying to do work also in Africa, in places in Africa. We're trying to do work in Ukraine. We're trying to really move to where we can really make a contribution and to try to identify how these substances can be used in different cultural contexts. Many of these countries don't have hardly any therapists or psychiatrists. So it's a question of who are the local healers, how do we help them, what are their local traditions? So that's a big part of it. I would also say, though, in addition to the global things, there's other kind of research that's not easily monetizable. So MAPS is looking at couples therapy. So we're trying to start research in couples therapy. It's not a clinical condition. And MAPS is also doing lots of work on drug policy reform and public education. And so I think MAPS is going to be fully busy, for decades and decades and decades to come. Can we reach this point of net zero trauma by 2070? That's kind of a that we hope. And to clarify that, there's basically two kinds of trauma. The first kind is traumas that you experience during your life, but the other is multi-generational trauma through epigenetic mechanisms by which trauma is passed down from parents to children. And when we think about what we just have heard, right before we went on, you were talking about Asheville and the floods that have just gone in Asheville. There's a project I'm going to Hawaii on where there's people that have PTSD from the fires. There's an estimate that by 2050, there could be over 1 billion climate refugees, which is going to totally destabilize the world. And hopefully that's an overestimate. But what I think is going to happen is that humanity is going to be under stress that's going to be increasing, in part because people are really good at pushing stuff away, at denial, at repression, it's interesting that it's not until just really recently that you stopped hearing people saying, oh, climate is not changing, or that people didn't do it. It's not influenced by humans. But climate denial is sort of diminishing. But I think that it's really essential to think about humanity as a whole and do what we can to reduce traumas and to reduce multi-generational transmission of trauma and to really work on drug policy reform and public education. So MAPS is doing all of those things as we go forward.
It's a beautiful vision, Rick. And so, as they noted in the WAPO article, you will not be smoking weed on the couch for the next 20 years. Right? So, shall we open it up to some questions? I know there's at least one there, Mark.
Yeah, I just got to say, Rick, thank you so much. There's so much there to digest. I look forward to coming back to it, but thank you for the great work you've done and just the persistence and everything you've overcome from, all the government and all that kind of crazy stuff. So we're going to bring in a question. We have Sasha here. I'm going to ask Sasha to unmute. You should be okay now, Sasha. There you go. Thanks for joining us. Where are you from, Sasha? Let's start there.
Yeah, I'm actually coming from, I'm calling from Asheville right now. I appreciate Dr. Doblin for taking a moment to recognize the devastation that has affected the region.
Carry on.
I have 3 brief questions for Dr. Doblin as well as a comment. He can respond to whatever he'd like. First, Dr. Doblin, do you have any regrets regarding the retraction of 3 MAPS-sponsored trial publications by the journal Psychopharmacology? Second, earlier, may I finish?
Go right ahead.
Go.
Thank you. Second, earlier in this discussion, you brought up a proposed project in Ukraine. You have previously referenced a desire to bring MDMA-assisted group psychotherapy to refugee camps within Ukraine. And I'd like to know if you are aware that your stated proposals violate Articles 6 and 8 of the Nuremberg Code. Third, do you have any apologies that you would like to offer to individuals who have been harmed by study therapists within MAPS-sponsored trials, or perhaps the psychedelic community at large? And as a final note, I'd like to offer Dr. Doblin an opportunity to challenge criticisms that I and other whistleblowers raised during the public comment period of the FDA Advisory Committee hearing on June 4th. It is my understanding that he is yet to provide public commentary on the issues raised by whistleblowers during the public comment period. That's all.
That's all. Okay. So
So
I
that's
think
enough.
it's good, Sasha, that you identified yourself as part of the groups that tried to really block the approval of MDMA by raising various different issues. I think it's going to be a lot, well, okay, maybe block it now. Certainly you were not in favor of FDA approval. Well, anyway.
Carry on, Rick.
Okay. So I think of all these, what I'd like to focus on is this, first off, this idea that it's violating the Nuremberg Code to try to work with refugees and help people who are suffering trauma. So I don't know what articles you mentioned in the Nuremberg Code that we're violating, but I don't believe that that's the case, and I think that we're coming from a place where we really want to provide healing for people that are in dire need of healing. So I think that's that one. As far as the papers that were retracted, I think that it would have been better for MAPS after it turned out that there was a sexual abuse situation of a therapist for a patient that was in the study. And that was made public, and that was reported to the FDA, and that was reported to the licensing boards, and that was reported to everybody that we thought. But it was not reported to the journal. And so I think that there was data from 104 people, and I think the retraction was really inappropriate. I think it would have been good to certainly we should have let the journal know about that one person. But then when we removed that one person's data, the data was essentially the same. And then they said remove all the data from all 4 people that group was treated. That was the Vancouver site. And when we removed the 4 people, the data actually got slightly better. And so I don't think that the appropriate thing was to retract the papers. I think it would have been better to, either remove the data or just keep that data. And I don't see why it was necessary to remove the data of the other 3 people. But anyway, that is something that I would regret. So I think that's enough on those questions.
Well, based on the fact that you and I, Rick, both have to split in 5 minutes, I think we should turn it back over to Marc to round up and tell people why they need to be at that conference, etc.
Well, Rick, yeah, I thank you for answering Sasha's questions. I think it's always an opportunity to, hear all voices and all sides. And, I think that, everything I've learned in the years I've been, doing this work with spirit plant medicine, if we do our best, and, in all things, there's things that work, things that don't, and there's problems. And I think the important thing is to address them and do the best that we can, because I really identify with what you're talking about from, the consciousness perspective. And that's what, Stephen is really driven about as well.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why we do the work that we do is to create a better world for everybody. And, it happens out there. It's not perfect, though. That being said, I thank you for your work and your perseverance. And I really look forward to meeting you in person And, to sum up, the things I've always learned is safe set and setting, know who you're working with, dosage. There's so many factors that always come up as a common thread in our conversations and the things that people are sharing. And I think it's important that we remember that and we do our best and we come in with open hearts and open minds and compassion and caring. So that's just what I wanted to throw in there. And this is what we talked about at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, where we have open dialogue. We have opportunity to meet like-minded people. And for those of you who may be watching online, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this after the fact, not everybody can always meet and join us in live in person. So we do a unique virtual experience, much like we're doing here in Zoom today. And we bring in our Zoom audience. We are able to connect and converse and see each other, as well as we put them up on the big screen in the conference hall. So our speakers can see our online guests, and they have an opportunity to engage in questions and answers as well. So even though you can't make it here in Vancouver on November 1st to 3rd, you can still join us from anywhere in the world at any time. And Rick, again, I just want to thank you for your time in joining us today. And if you have any final words, Stephen, go for it.
No, just to support what you said, Mark, that, in our, honestly modest way, we, because without humility, you're going down the wrong road, obviously. We're passionate about this vision for the kind of things Rick was talking about, that this planet is in deep trouble, and there's a great need for a consciousness transformation that needs to go deep and wide. And that's what the conference is for. And I'd also like to say that one of the, as briefly as possible, one of the features of our conference is that we do everything in one room. So everybody, in a sense, goes through a journey together. And I've come to label it an empowerment hub, as well as the other aspects of what we do. We're there partly to empower and strengthen and encourage each other. So we do encourage people to be part of that, whether, as Mark said, it can only be online, which is quite, going to be quite powerful for a lot of people as well, or if possible, in person to share that space with us. And also just, again, thank you, Rick, just echo what Mark said, that, great respect for the determined perseverance you've been working on to follow your vision for all these decades. And on that cheery note, I'll say goodbye.
Thanks for joining us as always, Stephen. If you've got any words in closing, Rick, we'd be happy to hear them, and I look forward to meeting you in person in 4 short weeks.
Yeah, I just like to add that as part of public education, MAPS is planning to host the world's largest conference on psychedelics ever, the 16th to the 20th of June, 2025 in Denver. And so
even bigger than the SPMC by a factor of about 100.
So the Psychedelic Science 2023, we had 12,400 people.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. So we're hoping for more this time, and we'd like to really invite people to consider coming to that. And that's where you can network, and that's where you can find out all sorts of new information on what's going on, and ask your questions, and really get a feel for how the whole field is developing around the world.
Great.
Well, I know that we're happy to share that with our community. MAPS Canada has always been a big part of the work we do with Marc Hayden and Trevor Miller and Riel Kapler right now. So we're always happy to have them at the conference and representing, so they will be there as well. And if you're watching this and tuning in, you can use the coupon code MAPS. You'll save 35%, same as Unify if you're watching on Unify. And we just want to make sure that this is accessible to everybody who wants to join us. So again, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Rick. My name is Marc Caron. You've been listening to Conscious Living here on 100.5 CFRO FM in Vancouver. Another Spirit Plant Medicine episode. We look forward to the conference in a few short weeks. And until then, everyone, take care of each other. Thank you.
Goodbye. Beautiful. Okay, I'm off. Thanks again, Rick.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you.